Have you ever stopped to think about how life sometimes seems to put giants in our path? Situations that seem too big, too difficult, too unfair. Well, the story I'm going to tell you today is about exactly that. And it's not just any story, it's the most epic battle in the Bible, a confrontation that changed the destiny of an entire people and revealed the power of a heart that trusts completely in God. Just imagine on one side, the Philistine army, with a giant nearly 3 meters tall named Goliath, challenging the entire army of Israel. On the other, a young shepherd, David, who apparently had no chance. But God likes to surprise. He does not choose the strongest by appearance, but those who carry courage, obedience, and faith in God in their hearts. And that is how David, anointed by the prophet Samuel, faced a challenge that no one had the courage to accept. In this story, we discover that true heroes do not stand out because of their size or shiny armor. They stand out because they carry the anointing and the Spirit of the Lord, and more because they understand that the battle is not theirs, but the Lord's. And if you have ever felt small in the face of a giant in your life, whoever maybe this content is for you, throughout this itinerary, we will revisit every detail of this historic moment. From Saul's rejection to David's choice, through the silent spiritual war and the incredible courage in the face of Goliath's challenge. And I guarantee you, in addition to inspiring you, this story will stir your faith and remind you of the divine purpose that exists in your life. So get ready, grab your harp or at least a good playlist, and come with me to understand how God's glory manifests itself when we least expect it, and what this has to do with your current moment. Because in the end, what matters is not the size of the giant, it's who is fighting alongside you. If you want to discover how to transform your own giants into victories for the Lord, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss any strategies of faith, courage, and divine purpose. Let's unravel this battle together and understand how music, anointing, and obedience made a difference for David and can make a difference for you too. When we talk about Saul, the first king of Israel, we must remember that he started out very well. He was a tall, imposing-looking man, chosen by the people to lead the army of Israel. However, his disobedience ended up costing him dearly. Saul did not follow orders properly, and therefore, God rejected him. Saul's rejection was not just any punishment, but a clear sign that God's plan was changing course. And this change required someone with a heart according to God, not just someone who looked like a leader. Samuel, the prophet and priest who anointed Saul, was deeply saddened by this situation. Just imagine having watched the growth of a king who suddenly loses the anointing, favor, and spirit of the Lord. But even in the midst of his sadness, Samuel knew that God always has a bigger and better plan. And God's promise to Israel did not depend on the failure of one man, but on the faithfulness of the Lord himself. That is why he received a divine mission that would change the history of the people forever. God commanded Samuel to go to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, to anoint a new king. It was a command that carried enormous weight. After all, the responsibility of choosing a successor to the rejected king was not for just anyone. But the prophet already knew that God's choice is not based on human standards. He needed to find a leader with courage, faith in God, and an obedient spirit, one who represented the true covenant between God and Israel. Jesse's house was an ordinary family, with sons who did not have any appearance of giants or military leaders. And this is essential for us to remember: the divine plan does not follow the logic of the world. Often, what seems simple and even rejected by others is exactly what God chooses to fulfill his purposes. This is a lesson that Saul's rejection leaves us, opening space for a new time, a new hope. At the heart of this whole story, there's a spiritual war going on. Saul loses his anointing, the Spirit of the Lord departs, and the enemy of the Philistines gain ground. But God, who is at the forefront of the divine plan, is already preparing the answer. The anointing is not lost. It is simply being transferred to someone who walks with the Lord in a genuine way. And this teaches us something important: when God rejects something, it is because he has something better in store. Finally, this moment of Saul's fall and the election of a new king reminds us that a heart according to God is worth much more than appearance. Saul had everything to be the perfect king in human eyes, but he lost because he did not obey. The new chosen one will be anointed because he carries the courage, faith, and bravery necessary to defeat the giant that is coming. But calm down, this part of the story is just beginning. Samuel arrived in Bethlehem with a heavy heart, knowing that there he would find the next king anointed by God. Jesse presented his sons one by one. Eliab, the oldest, seemed to have everything to be chosen strong, tall, and with the appearance of a leader. But God had already warned Samuel, "Do not look on outward appearance or height, for I have rejected him." The Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. This lesson is vital even today for anyone who wants to understand God's purpose. After Eliab came Abinadab, Shammah, and the other brothers, all of whom were rejected. Each of them could have been chosen to lead Israel, but something fundamental was missing: a heart according to God. The divine plan is not limited to what human eyes can see. How many times in life do we only look at the surface and miss what really matters? David's story invites us to see beyond appearances and value the true essence. Then David, the youngest, appeared, the one who used to tend sheep far from the hustle and bustle of the palace. A simple shepherd, with a heart full of faith, courage, and obedience to God. He was not as tall as his brothers, but he carried with him the Spirit of the Lord, the anointing that transforms anyone into a giant. This choice by God shows that true leadership is born from intimacy with him and the willingness to fulfill his purpose. Samuel then anointed David in secret, a ceremony filled with meaning and promise. The anointing with oil symbolized the Spirit of the Lord resting upon him, empowering him to face not only visible challenges, but especially the spiritual war that was coming. For those who want to learn, this moment is an invitation to seek daily anointing, the spiritual strengthening that prepares us to overcome life's giants. In practice, David's story as a shepherd may seem simple, but it is full of lessons. Taking care of sheep requires patience, courage, and attention, essential qualities for someone who is going to lead a people. Furthermore, the music that David played on the harp, even at this stage, was already beginning to reveal a gift that would be vital for his journey and for the relief of King Saul. Every detail of the divine plan was already falling into place. Finally, David's choice challenges us to look within, to value heart and courage over appearance. How often are we discarded by others, but God sees us with eyes of love and purpose. The story is just beginning, and soon we will see how the Spirit of the Lord manifests itself powerfully in David, paving the way for a victory that could never have been achieved by human strength. With David's anointing complete, a powerful shift begins to take place in the spiritual landscape of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, who begins to be tormented by an evil spirit permitted by God. This invisible spiritual warfare reveals that when disobedience reigns, divine protection is withdrawn. It is as if Saul were fighting a battle where his own soul was wounded, while the enemy giant grew before our eyes. On the other hand, the Spirit of the Lord rests powerfully upon David. The presence of God in his life brings courage, wisdom, and supernatural strength to face whatever is to come. It is precisely this anointing that transforms a simple shepherd into a man capable of leading an army and defeating giants. It is like when an athlete finds his best form only here. The strength comes from faith and obedience to God. While Saul suffers from this torment, his servants begin to look for practical solutions to ease the king's pain. They suggest bringing in someone to play music to soothe his troubled spirit. And that's where music as a deliverance comes into play. The harp, an instrument that David has mastered since he was a child, becomes a spiritual weapon that calms Saul and maintains order in the palace. This teaches us that the gift God gives us have purposes beyond what we can imagine. David's music has a surprising effect. The evil spirit is driven away whenever he plays. It is a powerful reminder that courage and bravery do not always manifest themselves in physical battles sometimes. It is a harp that brings victory through the Lord. This music represents the presence of God, capable of restoring, delivering, and bringing peace even in the most difficult times. A practical example for us cultivating our talents is a way of obeying God and participating in his plan. Saul's situation also shows how rejecting God has serious consequences, and what seemed like a political crisis was actually a spiritual wake-up call. The withdrawal of the Spirit of the Lord demonstrates that God's plan does not fail, but adapts. God is already preparing David to take his place in the army and in the leadership of Israel. So, even in difficult times, there's always a divine purpose working behind the scenes. Finally, this phase teaches us the importance of recognizing when the Spirit of God is active in our lives and when we need to seek renewal. The transition between Saul and David is a living lesson in faith in God and obedience, which guarantees victory in any battle, physical or spiritual. And the next step in the story will show how David enters into Saul's service, an encounter that will change everything. The moment David enters Saul's service is full of divine providence and learning for anyone who wants to serve with purpose. One of the king's servants recommends David, highlighting that he is a musician, brave, prudent, and above all, has the Lord on his side. This combination makes all the difference, doesn't it? We learn here that talent and faith need to go hand in hand to effectively fulfill God's plan. When David is called to play the harp, he has no idea that this small gesture would have a huge impact on the king's life and the destiny of Israel. His music alleviates Saul's pain and torment, showing that God's anointing is also manifested through art and sensitivity. More than technique, it is the presence of the Spirit of the Lord that transforms each note into a spiritual weapon against evil. Saul begins to love David almost as a son, recognizing the courage and wisdom that emanate from that young shepherd. He makes him his shield bearer, placing him close to his heart and the throne. This gesture shows how God works in secret, preparing the ground so that David can grow in experience and authority before his great mission. For those who are just starting out on a journey, this is a great lesson. Patience and obedience open doors at the right time. In addition to his musical talent, David also demonstrates courage and prudence in his actions, characteristics that captivate Saul and the army of Israel. He understands that serving is a way of exercising leadership, even if he is not yet in the position of king. This attitude is essential for those who want to achieve great goals, value each step, and prepare for what lies ahead, trusting in God's promise. Another interesting point is how music becomes an element of victory for the Lord within the palace. David, with his harp, goes beyond melody. He offers a moment of rest to a tormented king, showing that the glory of God can manifest itself in different ways. This story inspires us to identify our gifts and use them to fulfill the divine purpose, even in adverse situations. Finally, David serving Saul reminds us that God chooses the unlikely to accomplish the impossible. Even though he does not look like a giant, he stands out for his heart, his anointing, and his obedience. The preparation to face the giant Goliath was already underway, and the next chapter will take us to the challenge that shook the courage and faith of an entire people. Tensions between the Philistines and the army of Israel were at an all-time high. Both sides were preparing for war, knowing that the confrontation would not be easy. The mood in the camp was tense, almost like the silence before the storm. For Israel, this was a spiritual war as well as a physical one, because faith in God had to be greater than fear of the enemy. In the midst of this preparation, Goliath, the Philistine giant who seemed to come straight out of fairy tale or rather, an epic battle appeared. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, he strode confidently, his heavy armor on, his booming voice echoing through the valley. Goliath was not just a soldier, he was a symbol of the seemingly impossible challenge, of that giant that everyone fears to face. For 40 consecutive days, Goliath carried out his daily challenge, provoking the army of Israel, insulting and mocking them. No one dared to respond. It was as if the giant were a shadow that left the army paralyzed, without the courage to act. The rejection of fear, at that moment, became a spiritual battle for each soldier who had to decide between cowardice and faith in God. Imagine the scenario: tired, anxious, and disillusioned soldiers listening to the giant mock the covenant and the glory of God. The pressure for someone to speak up and stand up to Goliath was immense. But the giant's appearance intimidated even the bravest. Here we clearly see the difference between appearance versus heart, the lesson God wanted to teach all of Israel. Despite the collective fear, the war was not just against soldiers, but against spiritual forces that wanted to prevent God's plan from being fulfilled. Each challenge from Goliath was an attempt to break the faith of the army of Israel, who needed to find courage and trust in the Lord to win this battle. This is the essence of the spiritual warfare that we face to this day. And it is in this tense atmosphere that the story begins to change, with the unexpected arrival of David on the battlefield. But before we talk about him, it is worth reflecting how many Goliaths appear in our lives to challenge us, and how can we develop the courage and faith in God to face these giants. When Jesse sends David to take supplies to his brothers on the battlefield, He has no idea what is coming. The young shepherd, accustomed to tending sheep and listening to the silence of the mountains, arrives in a tense and fearful scenario. There, the challenge of the giant Goliath hangs in the air like a dark cloud, threatening to shake the heart of the army of Israel. David listens attentively to Goliath's provocations, who spares no insults or mockery. The courage of that young shepherd begins to stand out, because he does not just see a giant enemy, sees a spiritual challenge. It is impressive how, even in the face of collective fear, faith in God awakens in him a sense of mission, a certainty that the divine plan is about to be revealed. Outraged by the Philistines' insult, David asked his soldiers, "How can this pagan defy the army of the living God?" This question reveals a deep understanding of the spiritual war that was taking place. While many saw a gigantic problem, David saw an opportunity to display the glory of God, to bring victory to his people through the power of the Lord. It is at this moment that we realize how music, courage, and faith were coming together in divine purpose. David, a shepherd and anointed musician, was already beginning to show that appearance of frail, an unknown young man was not a parameter for God's choice. The Lord's choice is always linked to the heart, obedience, and anointing. Furthermore, this visit to the battlefield serves as a reminder that sometimes God places us in unexpected situations so that we can grow and fulfill a greater purpose. David did not plan to be a warrior at that moment, but his faith and courage prepared him for a mission that would change everything. Are you ready to hear the call that God has for your life? Finally, David's indignation at the giant's affront marks the beginning of a journey of faith, courage, and obedience. The next step will be the decision to face Goliath, a step that could only be taken by someone with a heart after God. David does not hesitate to ask about the reward the valiant warrior would receive for defeating Goliath. At that moment, his bravery was already clear, but understanding the divine purpose behind the mission was essential. The soldiers explained that the victor would gain riches, marriage with the king's daughter, and exemption from taxes of practical and social motivation. But for David, it was far from being the main incentive. For him, the true reward was in God's promise and the covenant that sustained the people of Israel. David saw beyond the human plan. He saw a calling to glorify God with his victory, to show that true strength comes from faith and obedience to God, not from weapons or appearances. This decision to face the giant was not just courage. It was an act of faith in the Spirit of the Lord resting upon him. Furthermore, this choice reveals a valuable lesson. Life's greatest challenges often come with great rewards, but what really counts is surrender to God's purpose. David was not seeking just a physical victory, but confirmation that God's plan was in action, and he was part of that plan. This awareness is what transforms a mere man into an instrument of God's glory. It is worth remembering that David, even as a young shepherd, understood the importance of obedience to God and spiritual courage. He did not allow himself to be intimidated by the giant, because he knew that the real battle was spiritual. David's courage was based on the anointing he received and on his heart, according to God, and not on the size of his sword or armor. This decision marks a turning point not only for David, but for the entire army of Israel. It is the moment when faith begins to overcome fear, and God's promise begins to be fulfilled in a concrete way. The giant, who seemed invincible, now had an adversary who came with the blessing and strength of the Lord. And when you face your own giants, have you ever stopped to think about what your true motivation is? Are you only seeking immediate rewards or a greater purpose, aligned with God's will? This reflection is essential to understanding the next chapter of this story. Now that you have heard the inspiring story of David and Goliath, I invite you to reflect: what giants are you facing in your life? Have you trusted in the divine plan and the courage that comes from faith, or have you let fear paralyze you? Remember, just like David, you too could be chosen by God to win seemingly impossible battles. The key is to have a heart according to God, firm in obedience and in the anointing of the Spirit of the Lord. So, how about taking the first step today? Identify your challenges, strengthen your faith, and fight bravely, knowing that victory comes from the Lord. Do you want to continue growing on this spiritual journey and discover more powerful stories that transform lives? Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and come with me on this journey of faith, courage, and divine purpose. Your victory is closer than you think.